Give her the Black Talon. General Grant's voice cut through the command center like a blade, and every officer in that room froze. Because 30 seconds earlier, the same room had been laughing. Laughing at a woman who walked into Fort Resolute with a file so thin it was nearly invisible, a sleeve with a ghost of a removed patch, and one quiet request at a supply depot that made a captain double over with laughter. Now 4 people were trapped in a blizzard. A slope was collapsing. A fuel line was bleeding into the snow. And the only person who could save them was the woman they had laughed at on day 1. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The bus dropped 11 candidates at Fort Resolute just before 6 in the morning on a Monday, and the cold hit like something personal. Colorado in late October doesn't ease you in. It grabs you by the collar and squeezes, and every candidate who stepped off that military transport felt it in their lungs before they felt it anywhere else. 10 of them came down the steps with the kind of energy that fills a room before anyone speaks. Decorated patches, firm handshakes already forming in their grips, eyes scanning the base like they were already measuring it for ownership. The 11th came down last. She carried one bag, a duffel so worn the stitching had been repaired at least twice, once with thread that didn't quite match the original color. Her uniform was clean and pressed, but her sleeves told a quiet story on her left arm. Just above the elbow, there was a faint rectangle of fabric slightly different in shade from the rest, the kind of difference you'd only notice if you were already looking. That rectangle was the ghost of a unit patch that had been removed. Removed carefully. Removed recently, she had no combat decorations visible. No cluster of ribbons, no awards tab. Her transfer papers, when they hit the receiving desk 20 minutes later, were the thinnest file the administrative sergeant on duty had processed in 4 years. He actually flipped the folder over to make sure he hadn't missed pages. He hadn't. Bennett, Claire A. Staff Sergeant, he read aloud, mostly to himself. No assigned unit, Transfer Authority General's Office, Fort Bragg. He looked up. She was already looking at the window on the far wall, not daydreaming, not distracted. She was tracking the angle of the morning light, measuring something. Sergeant Bennett, sir, you're in Barracks C. Orientation at 0800. Thank you. She picked up her bag and walked out. He watched her go. Something about her bothered him in a way he couldn't name yet. He chalked it up to the cold and went back to his coffee. The orientation was held in the main briefing hall, and by the time it started, the candidates had already begun sorting themselves, the way soldiers always do when you put them in a room together by reputation, by rank, by the invisible currency of who has done what and where and how visibly. Captain Blake Turner stood at the center of that currency exchange like a man who had never once doubted his exchange rate. He was 34, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that photographs well, and the kind of voice that carries across rooms without effort. 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations, a fitness score that the base physical training instructor had quietly described as genuinely unfair to the rest of the human population. Turner knew all of this about himself, the way a person knows their own reflection, not with arrogance exactly, but with a deep and settled comfort that had never seriously been challenged. He had already identified the competition. He had already ranked them in his head. It was something he did automatically, the way other people breathe. He had not yet placed Claire Bennett anywhere on that internal list because he hadn't registered her as competition. He'd registered her as a question mark, which bothered him more. "Who's the quiet one in the back?" he asked. Sergeant First Class Danny Calloway, who had arrived the day before and had already made friends with half the base. Calloway glanced back. "Bennett. Nobody knows her. File's basically empty." "Empty how?" "Empty like whoever she served with doesn't want anyone to know she served with them." Turner made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Administrative transfer. Probably pushed through to make the numbers look good." He said it quietly, almost to himself, but not quietly enough. 3 seats away, Lieutenant Maya Brooks heard it. Maya was compact and precise in the way of someone who had trained herself to take up exactly as much space as she needed and not a fraction more. She was an intelligence officer by training, which meant her job was noticing things before they became problems. She had already noticed Claire Bennett specifically. She had noticed the way Claire had entered the briefing hall 12 minutes earlier and spent the first 90 seconds doing something the other candidates weren't doing. Not looking at the people, looking at the room. Exits. 3 of them, 2 primary, 1 emergency. Wind flags visible through the eastern window. Maya had seen Claire's eyes track them for a full 2 seconds. And when the senior training instructor, Master Sergeant Leo Vargas, had walked to the podium, Claire's gaze had already moved to the elevated observation platform at the back of the hall. She had identified it as a firing position before anyone in the room had thought to call it one. Maya wrote a single note in her small field notebook and drew a circle around it. She did not share it with anyone. The orientation ended and the candidates were directed to the equipment depot for initial kit issue. This was when it happened, the moment that would live in Fort Resolute's memory for a long time afterward, retold in different ways depending on who was telling it and what they wanted it to mean. The equipment depot was run by Supply Sergeant Derek Moss. Moss had been running that depot for 9 years, and in that time, he had developed the particular brand of confidence that comes from being the person everyone needs to come to. He knew where everything was. He knew what existed and what didn't. He knew the inventory so completely that he could tell you, without looking, exactly how many boxes of 5.5 ammunition were sitting on the third shelf of the eastern wall. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing yet, was that the next 3 minutes were going to change the way he thought about his own certainty for the rest of his career. Claire approached the counter. The other candidates were filling out their request forms, cross-referencing the standard kit list. She set down her form and spoke in a voice that was steady and unhurried, not loud, not soft, just clear. "I'd like to request the Black Talon." Moss blinked. He actually blinked twice, which was not something he did often. Then he leaned forward slightly, as if he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, the Black Talon. Custom long-range precision rifle. I believe it's held in secure storage here." For a moment, Moss just looked at her. Then something shifted in his expression, not cruelty exactly, but the particular pleasure of a man who has caught someone in an error and intends to enjoy the correction. He straightened up, he smiled. "The Black Talon," he repeated loudly. Loudly enough that the candidates nearby looked up from their forms. Turner looked up first. "Son," Moss said, and then caught himself. "Sergeant, the Black Talon is not in any standard military catalog. It is not in my inventory system. It is, as far as anyone here is concerned, a bedtime story." He paused for effect, because Moss was a man who understood the power of a pause. "What it is not is something I can hand to someone who just wandered in from whatever administrative backwater issued these papers." He tapped the thin transfer file with one finger. Not hard enough to be outright disrespectful, just hard enough to make the point. Turner moved closer, and when he moved, 2 other candidates drifted with him the way planets drift toward a gravitational center. "Did she just ask for a ghost gun?" he said. And then the grin broke across his face and the laughter started. It wasn't vicious. That was the thing that made it land the way it did. It wasn't even mean-spirited in the way that cruelty usually is. It was dismissive. The kind of laugh that doesn't see you as a threat or an enemy, but simply doesn't see you at all. Like you're a punchline to a joke that told itself. Claire stood at that counter and she did not move. She did not flush. She did not pull her shoulders back or set her jaw or do any of the things a person does when they're working hard, not to show they've been hit. She simply absorbed it, the way a thick wall absorbs sound. And when the laughter started to settle, she looked at Moss and said evenly, "A standard rifle will be fine then." "Thank you." Moss handed her an M24, the standard training issue. He was still smiling when he did it. "Try not to shoot any legends with that," Turner said, and someone behind him laughed again. Claire picked up the rifle, checked it with 3 movements that took less than 5 seconds: bolt, chamber, barrel, and walked away. The check was so fast and so automatic that nobody consciously registered it. But Maya registered it. Maya wrote another note and drew another circle. That evening, the dining hall was warm and loud and full of the particular energy of people who are in competition with each other, but haven't yet admitted it. Turner was at the center of the largest table, and the Black Talon story had become the evening's entertainment. He told it well. He was a natural storyteller, which was part of what made him dangerous, and he added details that made it funnier each time. The administrative transfer, who walked in asking for a mythical weapon. The thin file, the look on Moss's face. Claire sat alone at a corner table. She was eating slowly, with the methodical focus of someone treating fuel intake as a practical matter. Her back was to the corner wall. Her eyes moved the room in intervals, not obviously, not in the sweeping way of someone who's been taught to do it, but with the small, casual glances of someone for whom it has become involuntary. She noted the candidates who laughed loudest. She noted the ones who laughed politely. She noted the ones who didn't laugh at all. She noted Maya Brooks, who was looking at her phone but whose eyes weren't moving. The way eyes move when you're actually looking at your phone. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had been in rooms that laughed at her before. She had been dismissed before, underestimated before, looked past before. She understood that this was in some ways an advantage. People who don't see you can't prepare for you. But she also understood, and this was the part that never stopped carrying weight, that the invisibility had a cost. That somewhere behind the discipline, behind the training, and the silence, and the refusal to flinch, there was a person who had given things that the uniform on her sleeve no longer reflected. Things that had been officially removed, officially sealed, officially classified into a drawer that most people didn't know existed. She thought about that drawer sometimes, not with bitterness, just with the quiet recognition of someone who has accepted a trade whose terms were not entirely of their choosing. She finished her meal, returned her tray, and walked back to Barracks C. She was asleep by 9:15. Turner was still talking at 11. The training began in earnest on Tuesday, and by the end of the first week, the rankings on the board told a story that most of the candidates accepted as truthful, and one of them was actively trying to understand. Turner was first. He was first in the physical assessment, first in the tactical planning review, and had received the highest marks in the first leadership simulation. He led confidently, decided quickly, and communicated with the kind of authority that made people want to follow him, even when they weren't sure he was right. He was, by most visible measures, exactly what the board score said he was. Claire was last. She was last in the group leadership drills, where candidates were graded on how visibly and vocally they directed their teams. She was last in the confidence assessment, which measured how assertively candidates presented their plans in front of evaluators. She finished fourth in the individual navigation exercise, not because she took the wrong route, but because she stopped twice to warn candidates behind her about terrain that would become dangerous after dark, which cost her time she didn't make back. Those 2 stops were not counted in her score. She did not protest this. On Wednesday of the first week, Master Sergeant Vargas ran a weapons proficiency drill that no one had been briefed on in advance. The candidates were taken into a darkened room with their assigned rifles on the table in front of them and told they had 90 seconds to disassemble the weapon completely and reassemble it to operational readiness. Standard drill. Every serious shooter had done it 100 times. Then Vargas turned off the lights, not dimmed, off. Total darkness. Someone swore. Someone else knocked something off a table. There was a general scrambling, the sound of metal parts being set down carefully, the rustle of candidates trying to remember where everything was by touch. Claire's hands were already moving. She hadn't paused when the lights went out. She hadn't even exhaled differently. Her fingers found the receiver, the bolt assembly, the barrel not hesitantly, not by feel and guess, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has done this in the dark, because the dark was once the actual condition, not a drill, the real thing. She had the rifle back together in 63 seconds. The next fastest candidate finished in 89. Nobody made a joke about the Black Talon that night, but nobody said anything about the disassembly time either. It was the kind of performance that was uncomfortable to acknowledge out loud when you've already decided what someone is. On Thursday, Vargas ran a navigation exercise that sent teams of 3 into the canyon system east of the base. The exercise was designed to test route selection under time pressure, and Turner's team, which he had selected and briefed himself, was moving fast and moving with conviction. Claire walked up beside him at the start line. Captain Turner. He looked at her with the pleasant patience of someone who has already won the argument in their head. Bennett, your route through Grid Echo takes you into the canyon switchbacks at around kilometer 4. Wind's been running northeast at about 12 knots since 0600. By the time your team hits that section, it'll be past 1700, and the thermal drop is going to push gusts through that corridor. She paused. The drone sensors in this exercise are calibrated to motion disruption. In those wind conditions, your team's movement signature will light them up before you see them. Turner looked at the route map in his hand. Then he looked at her. Appreciated, Sergeant. Are you changing the route? I'm noting your input. She held his gaze for one moment. Okay. 14 minutes into the exercise, a simulated enemy drone located Turner's unit in the canyon switchbacks at kilometer 4. The exercise halted. Turner's team stood at the designated failure point while an evaluator marked the board. Turner did not look angry. He looked briefly and privately, shaken the expression of a man whose certainty has encountered a fact it can't absorb yet. It passed quickly. He replaced it with the easier, more familiar expression of someone identifying what went wrong so he could explain it as a circumstance rather than a choice. Meanwhile, the communication breakdown at the exercise's eastern edge had separated 3 candidates from their teams. They were at Checkpoint 7, beyond the canyon, and the designated extraction route was no longer viable because of the drone detection suite that was now active across the primary trail grid. Claire found them 16 minutes after the main exercise collapsed. They were at Checkpoint 7's concrete marker, debating whether to hold position or backtrack. She was there before they'd finished the debate. "Follow me," she said. No explanation, no briefing. "Where are we?" One of them started. "There's an abandoned drainage tunnel that runs south-southwest from here to the edge of the training perimeter. 11 minutes if we move now. 23 if we don't." She was already walking. "Your choice," they followed her. The tunnel was real. It was also not on any map the candidates had been issued. It was on a maintenance document from 1987 that most people at Fort Resolute didn't know existed, and the question of how Claire Bennett knew about it was one that nobody had an immediate answer to. All 3 candidates came through without losing a piece of equipment. Claire came through last, having held the tunnel entrance while the others moved ahead. Vargas was standing at the perimeter when they emerged. He looked at Claire for a long time without speaking. Then he wrote something in his evaluation notebook and walked away. That night, Maya Brooks was in the intelligence office, pulling records. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for yet, which was the sign that she was looking for the right thing. The records for Claire's transfer were standard on the surface routing codes, administrative signatures, timestamped approvals until she hit the clearance wall. Not a red flag, not a denial, just a quiet, solid wall with a single line of text beyond it. Record sealed. Authorization level classified UBSL 4. Maya's clearance was SL3. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she pulled a different thread, not personnel records, but after-action database summaries. She searched for the transfer code on Claire's paperwork, cross-referenced it through 3 systems, and found, in a summary document from 6 years earlier, a partial reference. It was 3 lines in a 6-page operational review of a mission called Operation Silent Ridge. The operational review described the mission as canceled prior to deployment. Officially, no American forces were inserted. Officially, the 11 captured personnel extracted from the region during that window were rescued through a separate diplomatic channel, the details of which were also classified. But the 3rd line, and Maya had to read it twice, because the language was so bureaucratic it almost hid what it was saying. The 3rd line noted that the cordon holding the mountain evacuation corridor had been maintained for 8 hours and 47 minutes by a single unidentified element, enabling the extraction of 11 American personnel and 3 critically wounded team members. A single unidentified element. Maya set the document face down on the desk. She did not close the file. She left it open and stared at the turned-over page for a full 30 seconds. Then she picked up her notebook and looked at the 2 notes she had circled. The first, from the morning in the briefing hall, reads the room the way field operators do. Not curious, defensive. The second, from the equipment depot, checked the rifle in 5 seconds. Not as a reflex, as a confirmation. She added a 3rd note now. She did not circle it. She underlined it twice. She was already there. Friday of the first week ended with a medical field simulation, a scenario where candidates were expected to assess a mock casualty and coordinate a field evacuation under time pressure. The casualty actor was a trained volunteer. The scenario was controlled, except it wasn't. At 11:42 in the morning, in the middle of the simulation, Specialist Joel Carter, 26 years old, running his 2nd training exercise at Fort Resolute, went into anaphylactic shock. Not simulated. Real. His throat was closing, and he was on the ground before the candidates around him fully understood that this wasn't part of the scenario. There was a moment, one of those moments that exist in a space between seconds where everyone froze. Not from fear exactly, but from the sudden rupture of the expected. The simulation had an answer. This situation had a person dying. Claire was on her knees beside Carter before that moment finished. He's anaphylactic. He needs epinephrine. Who has a medical kit on their person right now? Her voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud because it carries authority the way a tuning fork carries a tone cleanly, without distortion. Not the simulation kit. Personal kit, go. 2 candidates moved immediately. One of them had a standard auto-injector. Claire administered it in the right position, at the right angle, without a moment of hesitation. She monitored his airway, positioned him correctly, and was already talking into the radio by the time the base medical team was responding to the alert she'd triggered. Carter was stable before the medics arrived. He would later describe what he remembered of those minutes in a sentence. She knew exactly what was wrong before she got to me. Claire refused to be photographed with Carter during his recovery. She refused the formal acknowledgement that Vargas offered. When he pressed her, she said simply, "He would have been okay." The team responded. Vargas looked at her. The team froze for about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is recoverable, she said. It's when people freeze longer that you have a problem. Turner, to his credit, did not make a joke about this. But in a private conversation with Calloway that evening, he said something that mattered more than a joke, because it revealed more. "She's been coached," he said. "She's been told exactly how to make these moves. The tunnel, the medical response, that's not natural instinct. That's scripted fieldcraft designed to make evaluators notice you." Calloway looked at him. "She saved the guy, Blake. She administered an injection and called for help. Anyone with field medicine could have done that." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Could you have done it that fast?" Turner didn't answer right away. That was, for those paying attention, its own kind of answer. On Saturday morning, Colonel Thomas sat in his office and read Claire Bennett's file for the 3rd time. The first reading had told him almost nothing. The second had made him uncomfortable in a vague way. The third, after 5 days of watching her in the training environment, made him put the file down and sit very still for a long time. He pulled up the administrative routing on her transfer. The general authorization on the paperwork was standard format, but the signatory line led somewhere unexpected when he traced it. General William Grant, Commander, Special Operations Training Command. Not a routine signature for a standard candidate transfer. Reed picked up his phone and began composing a request to contact General Grant's office. Before he could finish it, he found something else in the file, not a record, not an evaluation, but a standing directive. A single encrypted document, clearance-gated, that had apparently been sitting in the base's secure record system for 3 years without anyone needing to open it. He opened it now with his clearance code and read it twice. Standing Directive Equipment Authorization. Subject Bennett, Clara. If the above-named service member requests the rifle designated Black Talon Identifier BT-1, release is authorized only under direct personal authority of General William Grant, USASOTC. No other authorization is valid. No substitutes are acceptable. This directive does not expire. Reed sat with that document for a long time. He did not call Grant's office that day. The final exercise was starting in 48 hours, and he wanted to see what the exercise revealed before he made a call that he already sensed was going to change something about how he understood what was happening at his base. He was right about that. He just didn't know yet how completely. Sunday was the last day before the final exercise began, and the base had the particular quiet of a place holding its breath. Candidates reviewed gear. Vargas ran a final briefing that covered the official parameters of the 36-hour mission in the Colorado mountains. Turner sat in the front row and took notes with the focused attention of someone who intended to be excellent at a thing they had already planned to win. Claire sat 4 rows back. She didn't take notes, she listened. At the end of the briefing, as candidates filed out, Vargas stopped her with a question that wasn't on any official evaluation form. "Sergeant Bennett, hypothetically, if the exercise conditions deteriorate weather, communications, something unplanned, what's your priority?" She didn't hesitate. "The people." "Not the mission?" "The mission is for the people. If the people are in danger, the mission has already failed." Vargas looked at her for a moment. "That's not the doctrinal answer." "No," she agreed, "it's not." He nodded once, wrote nothing down, and walked away. That night, Claire sat on her bunk in Barrack C and looked at the faint rectangle on her sleeve. The ghost of a patch. She pressed her thumb against it lightly, the way you press against a bruise, not to hurt it, but to confirm it's still there. To confirm that what it represents is still real, even if the proof has been officially removed. She thought about 11 people in a mountain corridor 6 years ago. She thought about the cold. She thought about the hours. She thought about the decision she'd made when her commanding officer went down and the radio went silent, and the only voice left on that mountain was hers in the wind. She had made her choice then, and she would make it again. The question was whether Fort Resolute was ready to understand what that choice meant. She turned off the light. In 41 hours, the blizzard would answer that question for everyone. The transport trucks left Fort Resolute at 0500 Monday morning, and the cold came down off the mountains like a wall. Not the manageable cold of the base, the kind you walk through and forget. This was the kind that settles into your joints and stays there. That makes your fingers slower than your brain wants them to be. That reminds you, quietly and without apology, that the mountains do not care about your rank or your reputation or your score on any evaluation board. 11 candidates loaded into 2 trucks. Nobody talked much. The briefing the night before had been thorough. The mission parameters were clear. Everyone understood that the next 36 hours would determine who went home with a command slot and who went home with a polite letter of reassignment. The stakes had a weight to them that made small talk feel dishonest. Turner sat near the front of the first truck. He had reviewed his route plan 3 times since Saturday. He had it memorized. He had contingencies for the contingencies. He was, by any external measure, prepared. He sat with his arms crossed and his eyes forward, and if you looked at him, you would have said he was the picture of a man ready to lead. Claire sat near the back of the second truck. She was watching the sky through the gap in the canvas flap. Not the horizon. The sky. The way the clouds were moving, the direction, the speed. The color at the edges where the gray was just beginning to pull towards something heavier. Maya was beside her. They hadn't spoken much during the week, but they had developed the kind of quiet understanding that forms between people who've been paying attention to the same thing from different angles. Maya had her field notebook open on her knee. She wasn't writing in it. She was holding it the way people hold things when they're thinking through something they haven't finished yet. "How bad is it going to get?" Maya said quietly. She wasn't asking about the exercise. Claire looked at the sky for another moment. Bad enough. Maya wrote that down. She didn't know why, she just did. They reached the drop point at 0640, and Vargas gave the final go order from the base of the first ridge. Teams separated at the split trail and moved into the mountains on their designated routes. Turner's team took the northern approach, which was the more direct line to the observation target. Claire was assigned to the eastern approach with Maya and 2 other candidates, Sergeant First Class Andre Holloway, a quiet Georgian with 10 years of infantry behind him, and Corporal Danny Reyes, 23 years old, and running on the particular fuel of someone with something to prove. The first 2 hours were clean, cold, demanding, but clean. The ground was hard and the wind was manageable. The teams made good time on their opening legs. Radio check-ins came through clearly at the 30-minute intervals, and the evaluators monitoring from the mobile command post noted that all teams were within acceptable parameters. Holloway was a strong mover. Reyes was fast, almost too fast, with the kind of energy that looks like strength until the terrain changes and it reveals itself as impatience. Maya kept pace without complaint, though Claire noticed she was favoring her left knee slightly on the downhill sections. She didn't say anything about it. Maya didn't either. There was an unspoken agreement between people who understand what is required that some things are carried quietly. At 08:15, Claire stopped. "What is it?" Reyes asked. She was already 3 steps ahead and had to come back. Claire was looking at a ridge to the north, not moving. "Just looking. Wind changed," she said. Holloway came up beside her. He was quiet for a moment, reading the same thing she was reading. "Yeah," he said. "Changed how?" Reyes said. "It's still blowing." "It changed direction," Claire said. 11 minutes ago, it was northeast. Now it's running northwest." She paused. "That matters." Reyes looked at the ridge, then at her compass, then back at Claire. "We're still en route." "We are," Claire agreed. "But Turner's team isn't going to be comfortable at kilometer 7 if this keeps shifting." She pulled the radio from her chest rig. Static. She tried the frequency again. More static, but underneath it, something that might have been a signal trying to push through. "Comms are degrading," Holloway said. 15 minutes, maybe 20, Claire said. She stowed the radio and looked at Maya.
"You got the alternate frequency?"
"Yes, hold on to it." They kept moving. At 09:50, the first snow started. Not heavy. Just a suggestion, the kind of snow that feels like the sky clearing its throat before it says something serious. Reyes held out her palm and watched 3 flakes land and melt. "It's fine," she said. "It's the beginning," Claire said, and kept walking. By 10:40, the suggestion had become a statement. The snow was coming down with a steadiness that had purpose behind it, and the wind had picked up enough to give it direction. Visibility dropped from the open range they'd had at first light to something that felt like the world had moved into about 150 yards and stopped there. Radio check-in at 1100 hours produced nothing on the primary frequency. Claire tried the alternate, fragmented. She caught half a sentence from Vargas at the mobile command, post something about weather advisory and something else that might have been the word recall, but the signal broke before she could confirm. "Did he say recall?" Reyes asked. "I don't know what he said. If he's calling us back, we should go back. If he's calling us back, we'll know when we have a confirmed signal." Claire's voice was patient, not dismissive, grounded in the kind of precision that comes from understanding the difference between what you know and what you think you know. "Until then, we hold our last confirmed directive and we keep ourselves safe." Reyes didn't argue with that. She looked like she wanted to, but something in Claire's tone made the argument feel less important than she'd thought it was a moment before. At 11:23, everything changed. The sound came before the visual did, a mechanical thudding from the northwest that didn't match the wind, didn't match the weather, didn't match anything that was supposed to be in this sections of the mountains for the next 36 hours. Then the visual caught up, a military transport helicopter, a UH-60, moving low and fast, fighting the wind that was now gusting hard enough to feel like a physical force. It was descending, not landing, descending the way a heavy object descends when the thing keeping it in the air is losing the argument with gravity. They all saw it. That's not a drill, Holloway said. He said it in the flat tone of someone who has been in enough situations to recognize the real ones. No, Claire said. She was already moving. The helicopter went down beyond the eastern ridge, out of their direct sight line, but the sound told its own story, not an explosion. Not a catastrophic failure, but the brutally specific sound of a hard landing in bad terrain. Metal under stress. Rotors decelerating too fast. Then silence that was somehow louder than the crash. We have to go, Reyes said. She was already turned in that direction. Wait. Claire put a hand up, not aggressively. Just a hand up, flat, that said pause before you move. We don't know what's on the other side of that ridge. We don't know the terrain. We don't know what condition the aircraft is in. We move fast and we think slow, or we become a second emergency. Reyes stopped. Holloway, take the lead. You set pace. Not fast. Right. Maya, stay on the alternate radio frequency and keep trying. Reyes, you're behind me. Anyone see something unstable, call it loud. She looked at each of them once. Move. They went over the ridge in 8 minutes. What they found on the other side was this, a UH-60 on its left side. Rotors stopped, roughly 40 meters from the base of a steep slope that had come down on the downhill side of the impact zone. The fuselage was intact. There was no fire. But the fuel line running along the undercarriage had been compromised. Claire could see the dark stain spreading against the snow even from 30 meters away, and the slope above the wreck had cracks in it that nobody who had spent time in mountains would look at without their stomach tightening. 2 crew members were already out of the aircraft, one sitting up, one on his feet but holding his arm at an angle that made it clear he wouldn't be using it much. The pilot was still in the cockpit, visible through the cracked windscreen, moving, which was good, but not moving with the kind of deliberate coordination that would tell you they were unhurt. Hello, Holloway shouted. The one on his feet turned. We've got 3 on board. Pilot's conscious, but she's got something going on with her left leg. Martinez can't move without help, possible spinal. Thompson's with us, but his shoulder's dislocated. Claire was already at the aircraft door. She looked in. The pilot, late 30s, short hair, the particular steadiness of someone who is holding themselves together by concentrating very hard on being held together, looked back at her. Can you tell me your name? Claire said. Captain Renee Dillon. My leg hurts like you wouldn't believe, but I don't think it's broken. Move your toes for me. Dillon looked down and moved them. Yeah, okay. You're staying put for a minute while we figure out the best way to get you out without making it worse. Claire looked at the leg, looked at the angle of the aircraft, looked at the door. Give me 30 seconds. She stepped back. Holloway was beside her. Final concern on Martinez means we can't move him fast without a board, Holloway said quietly. I know, we're not going to move him fast. She looked at the slope above them. The cracks were not getting smaller. But we're not going to stay here long either. She pulled the radio again. Static, she tried 3 times. On the 4th try, she got Vargas for just long enough. Vargas, this is Bennett. We have a downed UH-60 at approximately, she gave the grid coordinates from her compass and the ridge landmark behind them. 3 crew requiring medical extraction, 1 possible spinal, 1 pilot with possible leg fracture, 1 walking. We also have a compromised fuel line and an unstable slope above the site. I need a medical evac, and I need someone to contact whoever was operating this aircraft immediately. Do you copy? The static held for 3 seconds. Then Bennett, copy partial. Confirm downed aircraft, medical extraction. Say again your position. She repeated it. This time the signal held long enough for Vargas to confirm receipt. Hold position, Vargas said. Evac team is, and the signal broke. Hold position, Reyes repeated. He said hold position. He said evac team is something, Claire said. We're holding position. What they did not do was stand still, because holding position didn't mean doing nothing. And the next 40 minutes were the most concentrated 40 minutes of work that Maya Brooks would ever witness in her career and spend the next decade trying to adequately describe to people who weren't there. Claire organized the extraction of Captain Dillon first, because Dillon could assist her own movement if guided correctly, and because getting her out of the aircraft reduced the weight stress on the fuselage, which was an issue given the angle. Holloway and Reyes worked together on Dillon, while Claire coordinated from outside, guiding each movement by sound and instruction with the particular calm of someone who has learned that panic is most dangerous when it's the calm person who catches it. Left shoulder first. Give her something to brace against. Don't let the door edge catch her hip. It came out in a steady, low stream. Not loud, not rushed, just present like a metronome that keeps the tempo when everything else wants to speed up. Dillon came out in 4 minutes. She was white-faced and breathing carefully, but she was out. And she sat in the snow with her back against a rock that Claire had specifically chosen for the angle provided against the wind. And she said, "Thank you." And Claire was already moving back to the aircraft. Martinez was the hard part. Martinez was 22 years old and scared in the way that people are scared when they can't feel everything they're supposed to feel. And the uncertainty of what that means is sitting on their chest like a physical object. He was conscious. He was talking. He was telling Claire about his mother in Phoenix and the dog he'd just gotten, a beagle named Cargo, and Claire let him talk because she understood that talking was how he was managing, and managing was what she needed him to do. "Keep telling me about Cargo," she said. "What's he like?" "He's stupid. Honestly, he gets excited about everything. Like, everything. You walk into the room and he acts like you've been gone for 3 years, even if you were only in the bathroom." "That's a good dog," Claire said. Her hands were moving, assessing his spine, his neck, his sensation response. "Does he sleep on the bed?" "I'm not supposed to let him." A small, shaky laugh. "He sleeps on the bed." "Okay, Martinez, I'm going to tell you something important and I need you to focus on me." She waited until his eyes were fully on hers. "We're going to move you. It's going to be slow and it might be uncomfortable, but you're going to be okay. I need you to not help us. I need you to go completely loose and let us do the work. Can you do that?" "Yeah." "Tell me about Cargo while we do it." It took 11 minutes. Every one of those minutes, the slope above them was doing what unstable slopes do when nobody's watching, which is shift, settle, realign itself toward the inevitable. Claire felt the timeline tightening like a string being pulled from both ends. She kept her hands steady. She kept her voice steady. She kept Martinez talking about Cargo. When he was out and positioned in the safest available spot, Thompson's shoulder was the fastest problem. Dislocated joints have a window, and it was closing, and Holloway handled it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had done this before, while Thompson stared at the sky and made a sound that was not quite a word, and then said, Okay, I'm good." The fuel stain in the snow was getting larger. Maya had been on the radio for 22 straight minutes and had finally gotten a clean connection to the Fort Resolute command center. She had given the full situation report, the grid, the crew status, the slope assessment. She had been clear and complete, which was what she had been trained to be. And on the other end of that radio, in the consent center at Fort Resolute, the evaluators and officers who had been monitoring the exercise through deteriorating communications suddenly had a very different picture of what was happening in those mountains than they'd had an hour ago. The exercise had stopped being an exercise. At the command center, Lieutenant Colonel James Park, the senior watch officer, pulled up the tactical display and looked at Claire's reported position. Then he looked at the weather overlay. Then he looked at the fuel line note in Maya's report. Then he called Colonel Reed. Reed arrived in the command center at 12:41. He looked at the display for 45 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "What's the evac window?" "When's the problem, sir?" "We have a window in approximately." Park checked the weather feed. "It's narrow. 40 minutes, maybe 50, before the next front closes it." "Do we have a bird ready?" "Yes, sir, standing by." Reed nodded. "Get it moving." He looked at the display again. "What's the slope assessment?" Sergeant Bennett reported visible cracking. "Our weather team says the thermal change in the next 30 to 40 minutes is going to." Park paused. "It's going to move the slope, sir." Reed looked at the fuel line note. He looked at the slope note. He looked at the grid position of 11 people in the snow. "What does she need?" he said. Park checked the situation report again. "She hasn't asked for anything beyond the evac, sir." Reed was quiet. He was thinking about the encrypted directive in his computer. He was thinking about the 3 words at the end of it. He was thinking about a thin transfer file and a ghost of a unit patch and a standing order signed by a general whose name he just spent a week trying to decide whether to call. He had not made that call. He was beginning to understand that the mountain had just made it for him. In the mountains, Claire stood between the downed helicopter and the 4 people she'd arranged as safely as she could manage, and looked up at the slope. The cracks had extended. She could see it without a spotter scope, which meant the timeline she'd been calculating in the back of her mind while she'd been moving Martinez and managing Thompson and keeping Dylan talking and monitoring Maya's radio attempts had just compressed significantly. Holloway came to stand beside her. He looked at the slope. He looked at the fuel stain. He looked at the evacuation helicopter that hadn't arrived yet. "What are we missing?" he said. "The route out goes north," she said. "The only flat ground for a helicopter is north. The slope, if it goes east-northeast." She paused. "But the fuel line is going to go before the slope does." Holloway absorbed this. "For the fuel? I don't know. The temperature's dropping, which slows the spread. But the structural damage to that line looked like more than a crack. If the wind shifts again and we get a static discharge." She stopped. She didn't need to finish that sentence. Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" And it was the right question. It was the question that separated the people who were trying to manage the situation from the people who were trying to help the person managing it. Claire looked at him with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was close to it. The look of someone who is carrying a heavy thing and has just had someone offer to hold one side. "I need the evacuation helicopter here in the next 25 minutes, she said. "And I need the slope to give us 30. Can you get the slope to give us 30? She looked at it again. There might be a way. She pulled her topo reference from her chest pocket. She studied it for 4 seconds. "There's a rock barrier at the head of that gully. If something triggered the charge point at the base of it before the slope goes naturally, the fall would channel east, not north. It would block the fuel reach and buy us the extraction window." "What triggers the charge point?" "A precise hit, approximately 1,900 meters. Through this wind." She looked at the sky. "With a standard rifle, the probability isn't good." Holloway looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is there another rifle?" Claire was quiet. She had not asked for it again since the depot. She had not mentioned it. She had carried the standard training rifle for 6 days through every exercise and every drill, and the weapon check in complete darkness, and the canyon navigation and the medical response, and she had never once said the name out loud since Moss had laughed. But Holloway had read something in her face that she hadn't intended to show, and the question he'd asked was not really a question about a rifle. It was a question about what she was. She picked up the radio. "Fort Resolute Command, this is Bennett. I need you to listen carefully. We have a compromised fuel line at the crash site and an unstable slope above it. If the slope releases naturally before our extraction window, it will push debris into the fuel zone, and we will have a fire with 4 injured personnel and a team of 4 unable to clear the area in time." She paused. "There is a charge point at the head of the rock barrier at grid reference." She gave the number, "at approximately 1,900 meters from my position. A precise hit on that point before the slope releases would channel the fall east and give us our window. I cannot make that shot with my current weapon in these conditions." She paused again. The command center was quiet on the other end. She said it plainly, the way she'd said everything plainly. From the first moment she'd walked up to that depot counter on Monday morning. "I need the Black Talon." And the command center at Fort Resolute, which had been monitoring a training exercise and was now monitoring something else entirely, fell into a silence that lasted just long enough for everyone in the room to understand that this was no longer a question about an inventory item. In the back of the room at the edge of the tactical display, a door opened. General William Grant walked in. He was 61 years old, with the kind of face that has been tested by enough years that it has stopped pretending. He had driven 4 hours from Colorado Springs that morning to observe the final assessment of Operation High Shield. He had arrived at the command center 20 minutes ago. He had been standing quietly at the back of the room, watching the displays and saying nothing, for reasons that nobody in that room fully understood yet. He walked forward now, slowly. Not because he was slow, but because he was thinking with each step, the way a person thinks when the decision in front of them is one they prepared for a long time ago and have been waiting, with patient certainty, to make. He looked at the tactical display. He looked at Claire's grid position. He looked at the slope assessment and the fuel line notation and the weather window closing on the top right corner of the screen. Then he looked at Colonel Reed. Reed was already looking at him. Reed had the expression of a man who has just understood something that changes the context of everything he has observed for the past week. Grant said, "Open secure storage." Reed hesitated. Not for long. But for a moment that was long enough to be visible.
Sir, the candidates aren't.
Grant's voice was quiet. It was not loud. It did not need to be. She isn't a candidate. He looked at the display one more time. He looked at the grid. He looked at the window. He looked at the fuel line note and the slope assessment and the 1,900 meters of wind and snow between Claire Bennett and the thing that needed to be done. He said it the way you say something you've waited a long time to be able to say out loud. Give her the Black Talon. The room was absolutely still. Moss, who had been standing near the equipment terminal since the situation had escalated 20 minutes ago, Moss, who had laughed at the counter on Monday morning, who had said the word legend like it was a synonym for fiction, who had tapped that thin file with his finger and smiled. Moss stood in that room and felt something move through him that he would spend a long time afterward trying to name. It was not shame exactly. It was something more complicated. The feeling of having been certain about something for a long time and discovering that your certainty was built on a foundation you hadn't bothered to check. Nobody in that room laughed. Nobody said a word. Park was already moving toward the secure storage authorization terminal, and the room around him was the particular kind of silence that only happens when everyone present has just understood, at the same moment, that they have been watching something they did not recognize until it declared itself. A rapid response helicopter was prepped in 4 minutes. The locked black case was loaded in 6. The flight time to Claire's position was 11 minutes. In the mountains, Claire stood in the snow and looked at the slope and listened to the wind and waited. She had been waiting in one form or another for 6 years. She was good at it. Maya came and stood beside her. She didn't say anything at first. Then she said, "They're sending it." Claire nodded. "The Black Talon," Maya said. Not a question, just the name. Said out loud for the first time by someone other than Claire without a trace of skepticism in it. Yes. Maya looked at the slope. "Can you make that shot?" Claire was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the snow between them. The sky pressed down with the weight of everything it intended to do. "Yes," she said. Maya nodded. She went back to the radio. Holloway came and stood where Maya had been. He looked at the slope. He looked at Claire. He said nothing at all, because he had served long enough to know that there are moments when the best thing you can offer a person is the space to be exactly who they are without requiring them to explain it. The sound of the helicopter came through the wind 11 minutes later. And in the command center at Fort Resolute, General William Grant stood in front of the tactical display and watched Claire's position marker and waited, the way a person waits when the thing they believe in is about to prove itself, not to them they already know, but to everyone else who needed to see it to understand. The black case was going down the line. The rifle inside it, calibrated to a specific posture, a specific reach, a specific breathing pattern, was about to meet the hands it had been built for. The slope was moving. The window was closing. And everything that had been building since Monday morning at an equipment depot counter, all of it, the laughter and the silence and the sealed records and the ghost of a patch and 11 people in a mountain corridor 6 years ago, all of it was about to land in one place, in one moment, in one shot. The helicopter set down 40 meters north of the crash site at 13:09, fighting the wind the entire way in. The pilot, a young warrant officer named Castillo, kept it on the ground for exactly 90 seconds, long enough for the crew chief to push the black case out the side door into Holloway's waiting arms, and long enough for Claire to receive it without ceremony, without pause, without any of the weight that a lesser moment might have demanded. Castillo didn't cut the engine. He was watching the slope. "You've got maybe 18 minutes on that ridge before it goes," he called out over the rotor noise. "Maybe less." Wind's shifting again. Claire already had the case open. Inside, nested in custom foam cut to its exact dimensions, was a rifle that didn't look the way weapons in films look. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't decorated. It was matte black and precisely made, and it had the particular quality of objects that have been built for one purpose with complete seriousness. No excess, no waste, nothing that wasn't there for a reason. Along the stock, in letters small enough that you had to look for them, was a single word engraved in silver: Resolute. Not a base name, a character. Claire lifted it with both hands, and the weight of it was exactly right. Not because rifles are supposed to feel a certain way in general, but because this one had been built to the measurements of her specific body, the length of her arms, the width of her grip, the angle of her shoulder when she pressed in. It had been calibrated 6 years ago by an armorer who had spent 3 days with data points and no name to attach them to. Just measurements, just numbers, just the physical geometry of one person who needed a tool that would not argue with her at the moment she needed it most. She seated it against her shoulder, and the fit was the way a key fits a lock it was cut for. Reyes was watching. She had been watching since the helicopter landed, and she was watching with the particular expression of someone who has been revising their understanding of a situation in real time and hasn't finished yet. "What is that?" she said. "The Black Talon," Holloway said quietly. Reyes looked at him, then at the rifle, then at Claire, who was already in position in the snow, prone. The rifle settled, her eye at the scope. "She asked for that at the depot," Reyes said. And Reyes went quiet. She turned back to watch. At the command center at Fort Resolute, the tactical display showed Claire's position marker as a steady blue dot. The slope assessment data in the lower right corner of the screen was updating every 90 seconds, fed by the weather station on the northern ridge. The numbers were moving in the wrong direction. General Grant stood with his arms at his side, not gripping anything, not pacing, just standing with the stillness of a person who has made the only decision available to them and is now in the part where they wait for the world to respond. Colonel Reed stood beside him. Reed was a careful man who had built his career on knowing what was happening in his command at all times. The past 30 minutes had reorganized several things he thought he knew, and he was still working through the reorganization with the honest discomfort of a person who is trying not to resist it. "Sir," Reed said quietly. "The standing order in her file." He paused. "How long has that been there?" 3 years, Grant said. "And where was the rifle?" "With me." Grant kept his eyes on the display. "She wouldn't take it initially. After Silent Ridge, when they told her she could have it, she said she didn't want a weapon that was a reminder." He paused. "She said she wanted to be done with the kind of situations that would require it." Reed absorbed this. Grant was quiet for a moment. "I called her 18 months ago, told her about High Shield, told her what I was actually trying to find out." He glanced at Reed briefly, then back to the display. "She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said fine, but she wanted one condition." "What condition?" "That she go in without any record, no patch, just herself." Grant's voice was even. "She wanted to know what the program would see when it couldn't see her service. She said if the program is worth anything, it should be able to recognize what it's looking at before it knows what it's looking at." Reed stood very still. "And if it couldn't, then she'd know what kind of program we were actually building." Grant turned his head to look at Reed directly for the first time since the conversation started. "She wasn't just being evaluated, Colonel. She was evaluating." In the snow, Claire had stopped thinking in words. This was the thing that nobody who hadn't done it could fully understand, and nobody who had done it needed explained. There is a level of concentration available to a trained long-range shooter in a real situation, not a range, not a simulation, a real one, with real stakes and real wind and real time, running out where language becomes unnecessary, where the mental chatter that runs beneath most human activity simply stops, the way a radio stops when you pull the power. And what remains is not emptiness, but a form of attention so complete that it feels, from the inside, like calm. She was not calm. She was focused. These are different things that can appear identical from the outside. The target was the charge housing at the base of the rock barrier at the head of the gully, 1,912 meters by her range estimation. The wind at her position was running northwest at approximately 14 knots. But the crosswind through the gully was a separate calculation. The terrain channeled it differently, and she had been reading it for the past 7 minutes, watching the snow lift and settle in the low places where the wind's direction revealed itself. She had 4 variables she could control: position, breath, trigger pressure, timing. She had approximately 11 variables she could not control, including the wind shift that was coming, the temperature drop that was affecting the round's trajectory in ways she was calculating without a ballistic computer, because the ballistic computer was in the helicopter that had crashed. Martinez was lying in the snow behind her. He was still talking about cargo quietly, to nobody in particular, because talking was what he was doing to stay present. She could hear his voice at the edge of her awareness, and it was, strangely, useful a human sound, grounding, real. Holloway was at her 7 o'clock monitoring the slope. He had agreed to call out at the first sign of movement on the upper section. He had not spoken in 4 minutes, which told her the slope was holding. For now, Maya had the radio. She was maintaining the open channel to the command center without transmitting, because transmitting would require her to think of things to say, and she understood that the most useful thing she could do right now was hold the line open and be silent. Reyes was watching the fuel stain. Claire had positioned her there specifically. If that stain starts moving toward the aircraft, she'd said, "You tell me immediately. and then you move everyone away from the helicopter on my signal. You understand?" Reyes had nodded. She hadn't asked why. She had simply accepted the assignment and gone to stand where she was told, and in doing so, had become more useful in the past 20 minutes than she had been in the entire preceding week. At 1318, Holloway said movement. Upper section left of center. Small. Claire's breath went steady. In, partial out. Hold. How small, she said. She said it without moving anything except her mouth. Small enough that it might just be settling. But it's moving. She adjusted for the wind, not by much, a fraction. The kind of adjustment that exists between numbers on a dial and the human understanding of what those numbers mean in a specific living moment. At the command center, Park said quietly, "The weather station is showing a gust coming in from the northwest. 12 seconds. Grant said nothing. He didn't move. Reed didn't breathe. The gust hit Claire's position at 1319. She felt it across her back, moving the snow around her in a fine drift. It was not as strong as the model had predicted, which meant the next one would be stronger, which meant she had a window between them that was approximately. She fired. The sound of a long-range precision rifle is not the sound that films have taught most people to expect. It is sharp and complete, and it ends cleanly. And in the mountains, it echoes in a way that seems to move through the rock, rather than bounce off it. The echo reached the crash site before anyone had finished processing that the shot had been fired. 1,912 meters away, the charge housing at the base of the rock barrier received the impact at 1319 and 12 seconds. Nothing happened for 1 second. 3. Reyes made a sound that wasn't a word. Holloway said flatly, movement on the upper section. More than small. Claire was already reloading. Her hands moved with the same automatic certainty they had moved in the dark room a week ago when the instructor cut the lights and the other candidates scrambled. The second round was seated before the echo of the first had finished moving through the rock. She had calculated this. The charge housing required 2 impacts to initiate the first destabilized, the second activated. This was in the technical documentation she had memorized 18 months ago. Sitting in a room with General Grant and a file of schematics, planning for a moment that she'd known, with the certainty of someone who has been in enough real situations, would eventually arrive. At the command center, the display flickered. A data point updated. Park said she's firing again. Grant said yes. The second shot left the barrel at 1319 and 27 seconds. At 1319 and 31 seconds, the rock barrier at the head of the gully initiated. The controlled collapse was not an explosion. It was not dramatic in the way of things built for drama. It was a wall of rock releasing its own weight in the direction that physics and geometry and one precisely placed shot had determined, and it went east, channeling down the gully in a roar that the candidates at the crash site felt through the soles of their boots before they heard it with their ears. The slope above the helicopter moved simultaneously, pushed by the same thermal and weight dynamics that Claire had read from the cracks in its surface. But the eastern channel created by the rock barrier redirected the mass of it away from the fuel stain, away from the aircraft, away from the 4 people in the snow who were alive, because someone had understood what needed to happen before the moment required that understanding. The roar lasted 11 seconds. Then it stopped. The silence after it was the kind of silence that has texture, the silence of something large having completed itself, of a physical reality having reorganized according to forces that were always going to win. Martinez said from somewhere behind Claire, "What was that?" "That was our way out," Holloway said. Claire stood up from the prone position. She did it without rushing, because the training that lives deepest in a person is the training that operates even when everything else is at maximum intensity. And the training said, verify your shot, secure your weapon, assess the situation. She did those 3 things in order. The charge point had activated. The channel was clear. The fuel stain had stopped spreading. She turned around. The candidates were looking at her, not at the slope, not at the cleared channel, at her. Reyes had both hands pressed flat against the sides of her legs, which was something people do when they need to feel something solid. Holloway's expression was the expression of a man who has been in the military for a long time and has developed very specific criteria for what impresses him, and those criteria had just been met. Maya was looking at her with the particular look of someone whose notebook is suddenly full of things they already knew, but hadn't finished understanding. Captain Dillon, sitting in the snow with her injured leg extended in front of her, said, "Who are you?" Claire said, "Staff Sergeant Claire Bennett. Let's get you out of here." Castillo had seen the channel clear from the air, He had already brought the helicopter back in before Claire had finished standing up, and he set it down on the north flat with the precision of someone who understood that the margin for error in the next few minutes was exactly as large as they chose to make it, and not a fraction larger. The loading of 4 injured crew members in mountain conditions with a closing weather window and a helicopter that had been fighting wind for the past hour took 14 minutes. It should have taken longer. It took 14 minutes because Claire organized it the way she organized everything, not with volume, not with urgency in the voice, but with a clarity of sequence that meant every person knew exactly what they were doing and exactly when, and the spaces between actions were filled with the right movement rather than the wrong noise. Martinez went first. Spinal concern always goes first. "Cargo's going to be very happy to see you," Claire told him as they loaded him. He laughed. It hurt him to laugh, which he didn't care about right now. Dylan went second. Thompson third. The crew member with the broken arm, whose name was Sergeant Patel, had insisted he was fine for the entire past hour and went fourth, still insisting. Reyes went next, with Holloway behind her. Maya paused at the helicopter door and turned back to look at Claire, who was standing at the edge of the cleared area, doing what she always did, which was making sure everyone else was accounted for before she accounted for herself. "Get on," Claire said. "You first." "Get on the helicopter, Lieutenant." Maya got on. She sat down and looked out the window and watched Claire do a final check of the site, not a hurried scan, a real check, the kind that takes 45 seconds and covers everything, and then walk to the helicopter door and pull herself up. Castillo had them in the air in 90 seconds. From the air, through the window, Claire looked down at the crash site. The slope debris had gone exactly where she'd calculated. The fuel stain was buried under a meter of rock and snow. The aircraft was still there, tilted on its side, and it would remain there until a recovery team could reach it in better conditions. But it was not on fire, which was the only thing that had mattered. She turned away from the window and checked on Martinez. He had fallen asleep. She sat back and closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let the concentration go, to release the hold that focus had been keeping on every system for the past 2 hours and allow the fatigue underneath it to surface and be acknowledged. It was there, it was significant, and it would wait until after the landing. At the command center, the room had been loud for about 30 seconds after the charge initiated, the particular loud of people in a controlled professional environment who have just watched something resolve itself that could have gone several other ways, and who are expressing the release of that tension through the volume of technical language. Call it what it is, controlled cheering from people who are trained to call it something else. Grant had not been loud. He had stood at the display and watched the position markers confirm what he already knew. And then he had exhaled once, slowly, the way a person exhales when they have been carrying something for a long time, and the thing they were carrying it for has arrived. Reed was beside him. Reed had been beside him for the past 45 minutes and had aged, in his own private understanding of himself, about 3 years. He looked at the display. He looked at the general. He said the only honest thing available to him. "I had no idea," he said. "No," Grant agreed. "Most people don't." The week. The whole week. Reed stopped. He tried again. She let them laugh at her. She didn't let them. She couldn't stop them. Grant turned to face Reed directly. But she understood something that most people don't. The laughing isn't the problem. The laughing is the test. The question isn't whether they'll laugh. The question is what you do while they're doing it and what you do after. He paused. She kept working. That's all. She just kept working. Reed stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "Turner." Grant's expression shifted slightly. "What about him? He's on the northern route. His team." "What happened with Reed?" checked with Park. Park turned from his terminal. Turner's team made the observation point. They completed the mission parameters before the weather fully closed. He's been trying to reach command for the past 20 minutes to report mission success. Park's voice was carefully neutral. "He doesn't know yet." Reed and Grant looked at each other. "He doesn't know," Reed said. "No." There was a particular quality to that silence. The silence of a man who completed a test while someone else was out there keeping people alive, and the test being completed and the people being kept alive being 2 different categories of thing, one scored, one not. And both of them now about to sit in the same room and require the same honest accounting. Grant said, "When the helicopter lands, I want a full debrief in the primary briefing hall. All candidates, all instructors. Colonel Reed, I'll ask you to sit at the table." Reed nodded. "Yes, sir." "And Sergeant Moss." Reed looked at him. Sir, Moss, I want him in the room. Reed nodded again, more slowly. The helicopter landed at Fort Resolute at 14:22. The injured crew members were transferred to the medical team that was waiting on the tarmac, and Martinez, who had woken up during the descent, gave a thumbs up from the stretcher that Reyes, who was walking beside him, found herself returning without thinking about it. Turner's team came in from the northern route 20 minutes later. Turner walked into the motor pool area with his team behind him, and the particular energy of a man who has just completed something difficult on schedule and expects this to be recognized. He was looking for Vargas. He was ready to report. He found, instead, the candidates from Claire's team, and the expressions on their faces were a language he didn't have a translation for yet. What happened, he said. Holloway looked at him, not with hostility, with something quieter. There was a helicopter down, he said. Eastern sector, 4 crew members. Turner looked around the group. He registered the state of them, the snow on the gear, the particular tired that isn't physical tiredness, but the fatigue of sustained intensity over a compressed period. He registered that they were all present, all accounted for. He registered the locked black case in Claire's hand. His eyes stopped on the case. He had seen supply cases before. He had handled most of the standard variants. This one he did not recognize. It was matte black with a brushed steel lock mechanism, and it had the particular quality of something that had been made very carefully for a very specific purpose. And it had Claire Bennett's fingerprints on the handle. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression of someone who has nothing to prove and is aware of it. Not triumph, not judgment. Just the calm that belongs to a person who has been where they needed to be and done what they needed to do. Turner said, "What is that?" Case, Claire said. He waited for more. She didn't give more. She walked past him toward the debrief building, and Turner stood in the motor pool and watched her go, and something happened in his chest that he would later, in an honest moment with himself, call the beginning of something important, not shame, not exactly, and not defeat, and not the simple recalibration of a person who has been corrected. Something more complicated. The beginning of a question he had been avoiding asking, which was whether the qualities he'd valued most in himself were the ones that would matter most when things went wrong. He didn't have an answer yet, but he was holding the question now, which was more than he'd been doing a week ago. Inside the briefing hall, the chairs were arranged differently than they had been for the initial orientation. No podium setup, no evaluation table facing ranked candidates. Chairs in a broad configuration that suggested conversation rather than assessment. Colonel Reed was at a central table. Beside him, in the chair closest to the door, sat General Grant. Turner walked in and stopped when he saw Grant. Stopped the way a person stops when the room they entered is larger than the room they expected. He looked at the general's uniform. He looked at the rank. He looked at the particular quality of attention in the room, which was the attention of people who are waiting for something to be explained to them that they already understand will change how they see the past week. He found a chair and sat down. He did not find the front row this time. He sat in the middle of the group. Claire came in last. She set the black case on the floor beside her chair, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. She looked at nothing in particular. She was waiting the way she waited for everything, with the patience of a person for whom waiting is simply the time between what has happened and what happens next. Grant looked at the room. He took his time doing it. He looked at each person. Then he said, 6 years ago, 11 American personnel were captured during an overseas operation. Their location was identified. A rescue mission was mobilized. He paused. The mission was designated Operation Silent Ridge. Officially, it was canceled before insertion. The room was very still. Unofficially, a single element was already on the ground, operating alone, without support, after the commanding officer was killed and the communications line was severed. He paused again. That element held a mountain corridor for 8 hours and 47 minutes. In that time, 11 captured personnel and 3 critically wounded team members were extracted. He looked at Claire. The shooter's name was removed from every accessible report, at her own request. Turner's jaw was tight. He was looking at Claire. Claire was looking at the floor in front of her. She refused public recognition, Grant continued, because revealing her identity would have endangered local personnel who assisted the rescue, civilians who had taken a significant personal risk. She considered their safety more important than her record. He let that land. She still does. A candidate near the window, a quiet man named Sergeant Davis, who had said almost nothing during the entire week of training, said, In a voice that was more thought out loud than question, she asked for the rifle on the first day. Yes, Grant said. Davis absorbed this. He looked at his hands. Grant said, I sent Sergeant Bennett to this program for a reason. Not to demonstrate her capability, though it has been demonstrated. I sent her to show this program what it was seeing and what it was missing. He looked at Reed. This program was selecting for visibility, for volume, for the performance of confidence. He looked at Turner, not for the substance underneath it. Turner did not look away. That, for those watching, was something. The exercise revealed more than the candidate's capabilities, Grant said. It revealed the program's values. And the program needs to examine those values honestly before it selects anyone for anything. Reed said, Sir, the review process will include a full assessment of evaluation criteria. Grant said, Yes, we'll talk about the specifics. He looked at the room one more time. But first, I want everyone here to sit with something for a moment. He reached down and picked up the black case from beside Claire's chair. He had to lean slightly to reach it, and Claire sat without moving while he did, and set it on the table in front of him. This rifle was built 6 years ago, he said. It was built for one person. It has never been fired in a training exercise. It has never been used to score a point or win an evaluation. He looked at each face in the room. It was used today to save 4 lives and give 8 people away out of an impossible situation. He paused. That is what it was built for. He set his hand on top of the case. The first morning she arrived here, he said, Sergeant Bennett walked up to a supply counter and asked for this rifle by name, and the room laughed. His voice carried no particular charge when he said it. No anger, no accusation, just the fact delivered cleanly allowed to mean what it meant. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what the room knew and what it assumed, and whether those are the same thing. Because in this work, in the actual work, not the exercises, not the evaluations, the real work, the cost of confusing those two things is not a deduction on a score sheet. He looked at the candidates. The cost is people. The room held that. Turner sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and thought about a woman standing at a counter with a thin file and a ghost of a unit patch and a request that the room had decided in about 4 seconds was a punchline. He thought about the route through grid echo that he hadn't changed. He thought about the exercise that had halted at kilometer 4. He thought about the sound of a helicopter going down in a blizzard and the fact that he had been on the other side of a ridge, completing mission parameters while 4 people were in the snow. He thought about what he would have done at that crash site. He thought about this for a long time, and he did not arrive at a comfortable answer. Reyes, sitting 2 chairs from Turner, was thinking about the moment she'd said the wind change was fine, just fine, because it was still blowing and the route was still on course. And fine was the easy answer, the one that didn't require her to slow down and look harder. She was thinking about how many times she'd said fine when she meant I don't know yet and chose not to admit it. Maya was thinking about the note she'd written in her field notebook on the first morning and hadn't shown to anyone. She was already there. She had known from the first hour. She had watched the disrespect happen across an entire week and had taken notes and drawn circles and said nothing out loud. Because saying something out loud would have required her to challenge the group's conclusion, and challenging the group's conclusion was uncomfortable. And she had chosen discomfort avoidance over honesty. She thought about what that choice had cost, not the mission today that had resolved, but the week, the daily small moments of choosing silence. Those had a cost she was only now beginning to add up. Holloway was not thinking about what he had done wrong. He was thinking about the tunnel on day 2. About the way Claire had said, follow me, and moved without waiting for consensus. He was thinking about the difference between confidence and certainty and how one of them needs an audience and the other one doesn't. Claire was thinking about cargo. She was thinking about Martinez on a stretcher, describing a beagle who got excited about everything. And she was thinking about how that specific detail, the dog, the bathroom, 3 years of absence compressed into a greeting had been the thing she'd reached for to keep him present while she worked. Not protocol, not training language. A dog named Cargo who slept on the bed despite instructions. She was thinking that the real work always has a cargo in it somewhere. Some detail that is completely human and completely irrelevant to the tactical situation and completely essential to the person inside it. She had not lost that. She hoped she never would. Grant said, we'll take 15 minutes. Then we'll talk about what comes next. People moved. People stood up and stretched and went for water and spoke in low voices. Turner stood and walked to the window and stood looking out of it at the mountains, which were now largely obscured by the weather that had been building all day. He stood there for a while. Then he walked across the room to where Claire was still seated. She looked up when he stopped in front of her. He said, "I sent a message to Calloway last week. Said you were probably coached. That the tunnel and the medical response were scripted to impress evaluators." I heard something like that. He took a breath. I said it because what you were doing made me uncomfortable, and I didn't want to examine why. He stopped, started again. I dismissed you because I'd already decided what you were. And I decided that without asking you a single question. Claire looked at him. She said nothing. "I don't know how to fix that," he said. "I don't know if it fixes." She said, "It fixes by doing the next thing differently." Quiet for a moment. "That hard," she said. "Simple and hard aren't the same thing." He nodded. He started to turn away. Then he stopped and said, without looking at her, "In the canyon." Grid echo. "You were right about the wind." "I know," she said. He almost quite, but almost. He walked back to the window. Moss was standing near the door, where he had been standing since Grant had said his name and Reed had delivered the instruction, and Moss had arrived in this room with the particular feeling of someone walking towards something they deserve but haven't been looking forward to. He had been in the back, away from the candidates, trying to decide what to do with himself in a space that his behavior had made complicated. Claire walked over to him before the 15 minutes were up. Moss looked at her. He looked the way people look when they have been sitting with a specific shame for a few hours, and the person it belongs to is now standing in front of them, not collapsed, not defensive, but tight, the way skin is tight over a bruise. "Sergeant Bennett," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Sergeant Moss." A pause. The rifle, he said. "It was in secure storage the whole time." "Yes, I know you didn't." He looked at her, "But I didn't ask either." She waited. "I should have verified," he said. "I should have checked the request properly instead of..." He stopped. "I made assumptions, and I made them loudly, and I let other people follow." He looked at the floor. "That's not an accident. That's a choice," Claire said. "It is. And you're making a different one right now." He looked up. Not warmly, not coldly, factually. The way she said most things that were true. She walked back to her chair and sat down. Moss stood at the door and breathed. When Grant called the room back to order for the second part of the debrief, the 15 minutes had done what 15 minutes can do when the people in them are being honest with themselves, which is not resolve anything, but begin the process of resolution. Begin the harder work. Crack the door that was closed and let in enough light to see by. Grant looked at the room. He looked at Reed. He looked at Claire. He said, "Let's talk about what this program is going to become." The debrief ran for 3 hours and 14 minutes, and nobody left the room early. That was the first sign that something had genuinely shifted. In the past week, the briefing sessions had always lost 1 or 2 candidates to bathroom breaks, water refills, the small physical restlessness of people who are physically capable of sitting still but emotionally resistant to it. This time, nobody moved toward the door. Nobody checked their watch in the obvious way. The room had the quality of a space where people understood that what was being said was more important than their comfort, and had decided, quietly and individually, to act accordingly. Grant had stepped back from the center of the room and let Reed run the formal portion of the debrief, which was the right call for reasons both practical and symbolic. Reed was the commander of Fort Resolute. What happened here was ultimately his to own, and Grant understood, as he understood most things, that giving Reed the space to lead the accountability process was the only way the accountability would actually stick. A general coming in and delivering verdicts from above produced compliance. A colonel standing in front of his own program and naming what went wrong produced change. At 15:07, Reed stood up and looked at the candidates and said, "This program has a problem. I've spent this week watching it, and I didn't name it clearly enough when I saw it. I'm naming it now." The room waited. "We rewarded performance," Reed said. "We rewarded it so consistently and so completely that we stopped asking whether what we were rewarding was performance of skill or performance of confidence. Those are not the same thing. One of them you can use in the field. One of them you can use in a briefing room. We need people who have both. But when we only measure one, we get very good at selecting for the wrong thing." He paused. He was not reading from notes. He had thought about this for the past 3 hours, and he was saying what he had concluded. "Captain Turner," he said. Turner looked up. "You completed the mission parameters. You reached the observation point. You transmitted coordinates correctly and on schedule. On a standard evaluation, you would have ranked first in the final exercise." Reed held his gaze. You were on the other side of a ridge completing paperwork while 4 people were in the snow. Not because you're a bad officer, because your program told you that completing the exercise was the highest priority, and you believed it, and nobody corrected you until it cost something real. Turner said nothing. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were open. He was receiving this. That's on you, Reed said. Both things are true. Turner nodded once. Small, but real. Reed looked at the broader group. The formal review begins tomorrow. Individual sessions with each candidate. I will be transparent about what we're looking for and what we found, and I will be honest about what this program is changing and why. He stopped. Today, I want us to do something harder than a formal review. I want us to talk honestly about this week, not about scores, about what we saw, what we said, and what we chose. A silence. Then Maya raised her hand. Reed looked at her. Lieutenant Brooks. Maya stood up. She had her field notebook in her hands, but she didn't open it. I knew from the first morning, she said. I saw the way Sergeant Bennett read the briefing room. I saw the rifle check at the depot. I wrote notes about it. I drew circles around the notes. She paused. I didn't say anything out loud. For an entire week. The room was very still. I didn't say anything because saying something would have required me to push against the group's conclusion. And the group's conclusion was loud and confident, and I wasn't sure enough of my own read to challenge it publicly. She looked at Claire, who was looking back at her, with an expression that was not forgiving exactly, because forgiveness wasn't what was required here, but honest. I'm sure now, and I'm standing up now. But I spent a week being sure in private and choosing silence in public, and I need to say that out loud because it's true and because it matters. She sat down. The room absorbed this. A few candidates shifted in their chairs, the particular shifting of people who recognize themselves in what has just been described and are sitting with that recognition. Sergeant First Class Holloway said, from his chair, without standing, I thought she was good from day 2. The tunnel. I thought that woman knows these mountains better than she should, for someone who hasn't been briefed on this terrain. And I thought it, and I went back to my rack, and I didn't follow that thought anywhere useful. He paused. That's a failure of intellectual honesty. I'm naming it. Davis, the quiet candidate by the window, said, I laughed at the depot. He said it simply. No performance in it. I heard Turner's joke and I laughed. I didn't know her. I didn't have any information about her. I just laughed because the room was laughing. He paused. That's not a mistake I made because I'm cruel. It's a mistake I made because I wasn't paying attention. Because I let the room think for me for about 4 seconds, and those 4 seconds weren't free. One by one, in different voices and with different levels of ease, the people in the room named what they had done. Not all of them. 2 candidates said nothing, which was its own kind of information. But most of them said something, and what they said was unscripted and specific, and therefore worth far more than any formal acknowledgement would have been. Turner had not spoken yet. Reed had not pushed him. Grant had not looked at him. Nobody had applied the pressure that would have made whatever Turner said the result of that pressure, rather than the result of Turner. At 15:41, Turner stood up. He was quiet for a moment before he started. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation, but preparation, the quiet of a person assembling the honest version of something that has an easier dishonest version available. I built my identity around being the strongest person in the room, he said. I didn't know that was what I was doing. I thought I was being competitive. I thought competitive was a value in this work. He stopped. It is a value. But it's not the only one, and it's not always the highest one, and I confused those 2 things for long enough that they started to feel like the same thing. He was looking at the floor. Then he looked up. Sergeant Bennett told me at the start line that my route through Grid Echo was going to get the team detected. She was right. I didn't change the route because changing the route would have meant admitting that someone I'd already decided wasn't a serious competitor had seen something I'd missed. He paused. That's not a tactical error. That's a character error. Tactical errors are fixable with better planning. Character errors require something harder. He looked at Claire. I'm not asking you to accept an apology, he said. I don't think I've earned the right to ask you for anything. I'm saying what happened out loud because saying it in private, in my head, where I'm the only audience, is not the same thing as saying it where it can be held accountable. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that's the right instinct. Turner sat down. The room breathed. Grant, from his chair at the edge of the table, said quietly, that took courage. He said it without fanfare. It was just a fact noted. At 1600 hours, Reed called a 15-minute break, and the room dispersed into the hallway with the particular energy of people who have been holding something tightly for a long time and have been given permission to set it down for a moment. Not solve things like this, don't solve in an afternoon, but held differently. Carried with more honesty than they'd been carried with an hour ago. Reyes found Claire near the water station at the end of the hall. "Can I ask you something?" Reyes said. "Yes, in the mountains." "When I said the wind change was fine," she paused. "You didn't correct me. You just kept walking." "Yes." "Why? You knew I was wrong." Claire considered this. "Because correcting you wasn't the most important thing in that moment. Moving was. And because the lesson isn't in me correcting you. The lesson is in what happened after you said it and what you remember about saying it." She paused. "Do you remember?" "Yes," Reyes said. "Immediately." "Then it worked." Reyes was quiet. "That's a different kind of teaching than I'm used to. Most teaching people, remember, is the kind that happened to them without their permission," Claire said. "The other kind takes longer, but it goes deeper." Reyes turned her water cup in her hands. "Is that how you learned? Someone let you make mistakes and watched?" Claire said, "Someone believed I was capable of understanding the consequences of my own choices without having to be told every time. That was the greatest thing anyone ever did for me professionally." She paused. "It was also occasionally very hard." Reyes almost smiled. "Yeah, I bet." She took a sip of her water. "What happens to us now?" "The candidates. That's up to the review process." "But what do you think?" Claire looked at her. "I think most of the people in that room are better than what this week asked them to be. And I think the program needs to ask them to be more." She paused. "Including you." Reyes stood a little straighter. "Not from correction. From being seen." The formal review process began at 0800 the following morning and ran for 4 days. It was not the kind of review that produces clean conclusions on a schedule. Real reviews, the kind that mean something, never are. They are iterative and uncomfortable and full of the particular friction of people encountering the difference between what they intended and what they did. Reed ran the individual sessions himself, with Grant available as a resource but deliberately not present in the room. He had individual 90-minute conversations with each candidate, and the transcripts of those conversations, which were not shared, filled a folder that Reed kept in his locked desk for the next 3 years and referred to more than any other document in his career. Turner's session ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Reed had expected to spend most of it managing defensiveness. He had a structure prepared for that. What he did not have a structure for was a man who walked in already knowing what he had done wrong and wanting to understand it rather than survive it. Turner didn't want absolution. He didn't want a path back to the top of the ranking. He wanted to understand the mechanism, not just what he'd done, but why, where it came from, what had built it. "When did it start?" Turner asked in the middle of the session. "The thing where I needed to be the best. When does something like that start?" Reed had not expected to be asked. He sat with the question for a moment. "Usually early," he said. "Usually in a context where being the best was the primary way you received confirmation that you mattered." Turner was quiet. "Does that sound familiar?" Reed said. A long pause. "My father was military," Turner said. He wasn't a cruel man. He was just someone for whom the performance was the proof. You showed what you were by what you could do." "I never questioned that framework. I just built my whole life inside it." Reed said, "That framework works well in a lot of situations." "It's not wrong. It's incomplete." "What's the complete version?" "The complete version includes what you do when you're not the best," Reed said. "And whether you can recognize excellence in someone else without it feeling like a threat." Turner sat with that for a long time. He came out of the session with his recommendation status officially under review, which was the administrative reality, and with something else that the administrative system didn't have a box for a beginning. And not of rehabilitation, not of apology. The beginning of a different way of understanding what he was trying to become. Moss's session was shorter and harder in a different way. He sat across from Reed at 0900 on the second day, and he was honest in the way people are honest when they've already been honest with themselves. And the external honesty is just catching up. "I knew the request was unusual," he said. "I didn't treat it as unusual. I treated it as ridiculous. There's a difference." "Why?" "Because she was..." Moss stopped. He started again. "Because she didn't look like what I expected the person making that request to look like. And I made that judgment in about 4 seconds, and I made it publicly, and I gave other people permission to join me. What should have happened? I should have run verification. Any unusual equipment request gets verified through the chain. That's procedure. I know the procedure. I chose not to follow it because following it would have required me to take the request seriously, and I'd already decided not to. He put his hands flat on the table. That is a dereliction, not of the spirit of the procedure, of the actual procedure. I failed to do my job. Reed said, "What do you think the consequence should be?" Moss looked at him. "Formal reprimand on record, mandatory retraining on equipment verification protocols, and honestly some kind of accountability for the culture of the depot. Because what I did wasn't isolated. It came from a place where we had developed habits around certain kinds of judgment, and those habits didn't get challenged because nobody had stood on the other side of the counter and said, 'Actually, you're wrong.'" Reed wrote something. "Sergeant Bennett has asked that you be retained and retrained rather than dismissed, provided you accept responsibility." Moss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's more than I deserve." "She disagrees," Reed said. Moss looked at the wall for a second. Then he looked back at Reed. "Tell her I understand what she did. I'll try to be worth it." Reed wrote that down too. The outcome of the formal review was not announced until the fourth day, at a full assembly of candidates and staff. Reed stood at the front of the room and delivered it in the straightforward language of institutional decision-making, which everyone present understood was also the language of something that had decided to be honest about itself. Turner was removed from command consideration for Operation High Shield. The language of the official decision described it as a deferral pending further development, which was accurate. Reed had fought for deferral rather than elimination, not because Turner deserved special treatment, but because eliminating him would have been cleaner and easier than the harder thing, which was keeping him in a context where he had to grow. The military loses a lot of good people by deciding that failing a test means failing permanently. Reed did not want to be another instance of that. Turner received the decision in the full assembly with his hands on his knees and his chin level. He did not argue. He did not look for the exit. He sat with it the way he was learning to sit with things that were true and uncomfortable at the same time. 3 other candidates received commendation in their files. Holloway for tactical performance, Maya for intelligence assessment. Reyes in this one surprised her for field adaptability under crisis conditions, a note that specifically cited her performance in the fuel monitoring and evacuation coordination at the crash site. Reyes read that commendation twice and sat very still for a moment. Then she looked across the room at Claire, who was looking back at her with the particular expression that was not a smile, but functioned like one. The command assignment for Operation High Shield was announced last. Reed said, "The command of the new High Shield Reconnaissance School is offered to Staff Sergeant Claire Bennett, contingent on her acceptance of the role under the following conditions, which she has proposed and this command endorses." He read the conditions. Candidate records would be partially concealed during early assessment phases to reduce the influence of prior reputation on evaluator judgment. Leadership scoring would include documented evidence of listening behavior, risk communication, and demonstrated responsibility for teammate welfare. Physical metrics would remain part of this assessment, but would not be weighted above judgment metrics in the overall scoring. Every candidate, regardless of rank or prior commendation, would begin the program with an equal visible record. The room was quiet while he read. When he finished, Davis said, from his chair, that's what she was demonstrating. The whole week. Those conditions, she was living them. Reed said yes. Davis sat back. The whole thing was a demonstration. The whole thing, Reed confirmed, was an evaluation of the program, not just of the candidates. The room took a moment to absorb this. The particular feeling of having been inside something for a week without understanding its full shape, and then seeing the from outside it, was not comfortable, but it was useful. Maya said, "Does she accept?" Reed looked at Claire. Claire stood up. She said, "I accept under one additional condition that I'm adding now." Reed waited. "Captain Turner remains at Fort Resolute," she said. "Not as a candidate, not under any evaluation structure, as a student. He works with the first cohort of the new program. He takes the same assessments in the same format. He is not assessed for command. He is assessed for growth." She paused. "If he completes a full cycle honestly, his command deferral gets reviewed." The room looked at Turner. Turner was looking at Claire. His expression was complicated in a way that had several things in it simultaneously: surprise and something that might have been gratitude. And underneath both of those, something rawer. The look of a person who has been given something they did not expect to be given by the person they least expected to give it. He said, "Why?" Claire said, "Because courage without humility is dangerous. But humility without courage is useless. You have the courage. You're learning the humility. That's worth investing in. She sat back down. Grant, at the edge of the room, said nothing. He was looking at the window. But his expression was the expression of a person who has watched something arrive exactly as they imagined it could, and is allowing themselves the private satisfaction of that without making it about themselves. Reed said, "Are there any other conditions?" Claire said, "No." "Then it's settled." The assembly broke with the particular energy of a group of people who have been through something real together and know it, which is a different energy from the beginning of anything. Not excited, not relieved, but awake. Present in a way that events can make you present that ordinary days cannot. Turner walked to Claire after the assembly. He had walked to her twice now in 3 days, and each time it had cost him something. And he was beginning to understand that the things that cost something were the things worth doing. He said the condition. "Staying here as a student." "You didn't have to do that." "No." "Why did you?" She said, "I've seen what happens when people who have the capability, but not yet the character, get discarded before they finish developing. I've seen what they become when there's no structure holding them to a better version of themselves." She paused. "I've also seen what they become when there is." He said, "What do they become?" Occasionally, she said, "The best person in the room," without needing anyone to notice. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll try to be worth it." "Same as That's all I'm asking," she said. She picked up the black case and walked out of the briefing hall into the afternoon, where the mountains were clear after 2 days of weather, and the light was doing what Colorado light does in November, coming in low and clean and making everything look like it was being seen for the first time. She didn't look at the mountains for their beauty. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, for what they were telling her, practically, about what the next hour required. What they were telling her was that the weather window was good and the terrain was manageable, and if she started the work now, there was plenty of time before dark. She walked toward the administration building to begin the paperwork that would officially establish the High Shield Reconnaissance School. Behind her in the briefing hall, Maya sat down with a blank page in her field notebook. She wrote at the top, "What I know, what I assumed, what I should have said." She drew 3 columns. She filled the first column before she realized she'd started. Moss went back to the depot at 16:30. He spent 2 hours reorganizing the equipment verification protocol documentation, rewriting the request intake procedure from scratch, and going through every standing inventory item against the verification standard he'd been not quite following for 9 years. He did not do it because Reed had told him to. He had not been told to do it today. He did it because it was the right next thing to do, and doing the right next thing without being told was the beginning of the change he had promised. At 1800 hours, the depot phone rang. It was Claire. She said, "The Black Talon needs to go to secure storage when you have a moment." "Yes, Sergeant." "Thank you, Sergeant Moss." He held the phone for a second after she hung up. He thought about the counter on Monday morning, the thin file, the laugh, the way the sound had filled the room. He thought about what it cost and who had paid it. Then he went to collect the case. Turner, at 1900 hours, was sitting in the barracks common room with the program manual for Operation High Shield's original design open on the table in front of him. He was reading the leadership assessment criteria. He was reading them with the particular attention of someone who is looking at a document and seeing both what it says and what it assumes, and understanding for the first time that the gap between those two things is where most problems live. He got a piece of paper and started writing, not a report, not an after action. He was writing the thing he should have written the night of the dining hall, when the laughter was at its loudest and Claire was at her corner table eating alone. He was writing down, honestly, in plain language, what he had seen that week and what he had said and what he had chosen. He was writing it for himself, not for any review board, because the review board's version of accountability would be the institutional version, and he needed the personal version too. And he was beginning to understand that the personal version was actually harder. He wrote for an hour. He put the paper in his left breast pocket, where he kept the things he needed to remember but didn't want to display. Then he went to bed. In the administration building, Claire signed the last page of the command acceptance documentation at 21:15. Reed was there as the witnessing officer. Grant had gone back to Colorado Springs hours earlier. But before he'd left, he'd stopped by the administration building and said one thing to Claire in the hallway. Privately, away from the rooms and the ranks and the official vocabulary of everything that had just happened. He'd said, I know what it cost you. The week. Letting it happen. She'd said it was necessary. He'd said, that doesn't mean it wasn't hard. She'd looked at him for a moment. The hard things that are necessary are the ones worth doing, she'd said. That's not wisdom. That's just arithmetic. He had smiled at that. Really smiled. The way a person smiles when something lands exactly right. Good luck, Commander. She had not smiled back, but something in her face had shifted. Something that acknowledged the word. The new word. The weight and the shape of it, Commander. She signed the last page and dated it and handed the pen back to Reed. Reed looked at the signature, then at her. He said, for what it's worth, I'm sorry for what this week looked like, for what we allowed. She said, change the program. That's worth more. He nodded, yes, ma'am. She picked up the black case and walked to the door. Then she stopped and turned back. Colonel Reed. He looked up from the paperwork. The conditions I set for the program. They apply to the evaluators, too. He held her gaze. I know. Including me, he said. Without hesitation, she walked out into the dark Colorado night, and the mountains were still there, the way mountains always are, indifferent to rank, indifferent to reputation, indifferent to everything except what you actually do when the real test presents itself. She had known that about mountains for a long time. She was glad, finally, that everyone else in Fort Resolute was beginning to understand it too. The first cohort of the new High Shield Reconnaissance School arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the command documents were signed, and the base that received them was recognizably Fort Resolute, but functionally something different, not in its buildings or its equipment or the mountains behind it, but in the habits of the people who ran it. Small habits, the kind that don't announce themselves. Moss stood at the equipment depot counter at 06:30. 20 minutes before the first candidates were scheduled to arrive for kit issue, and he ran through the verification checklist the same way he had run through it every morning for the past 11 weeks. Not because someone was watching, because the checklist was there, and running it was the job, and the job mattered. And those 3 things, in that order, were the understanding he had rebuilt his professional identity around after the conversation with Reed and the phone call from Claire and the 2 hours alone in the depot reorganizing 12 years of accumulated shortcut into something he could stand behind. He had changed the intake form, not dramatically. He had added 4 lines to the standard request section. 1 line asked for the purpose of the equipment request. 1 line asked for the authorization chain. 1 line asked whether the item was listed in the standard catalog or required a secondary verification. And the last line, the one he had written and rewritten 7 times before settling on the final version, simply said, if in doubt, verify before assuming. He had laminated that form and posted it above his own workstation, where he would see it every time he looked up. His staff had asked him, in the first week, why he'd changed the process. He'd said because the old process had a gap in it, and gaps are expensive. They had accepted this and implemented the new form without complaint, and within 2 weeks, it had already caught 2 unusual requests that the old process would have dismissed, 1 legitimate and routed correctly, 1 that needed further authorization before it could proceed. The system was working the way systems work when the people inside them decide to take them seriously. Moss knew that none of this fixed what had happened at that counter on a Monday morning 3 months ago. He was not under the impression that procedural improvement was the same thing as moral repair. But he also understood, with the practical honesty of a man who has done something wrong and is trying to do better, rather than trying to feel better about having done it, that the most useful response to a failure is not to perform remorse, but to build something that makes the failure less likely to happen again. He had built it. It was running. It was real. The first candidates came through his counter at 07:10, 17 of them, filing in with the particular energy of people arriving somewhere that matters. He processed each request with the same unhurried attention, the same verification check, the same eye contact at the end, a small thing. Looking at the person across the counter rather than at the form, but something he had started doing deliberately and had discovered was less small than it seemed. None of them asked for anything unusual. None of them needed to, yet. In the intelligence office on the 2nd floor of the administration building, Maya Brooks had been at her desk since 05:45. She had a different desk now, not physically relocated, but reorganized in the way that a person reorganizes a workspace when their understanding of their work has changed. The notebook was still there. There were several of them now, spanning the past 3 months, each one filled with the careful, precise observations that were her native language. But alongside the notebooks was something new, a running log she called the action column. It was exactly what it sounded like. Anytime she wrote an observation in her notebook, she added a line in the action column. What she had done with the observation, or, and this was the harder discipline, why she had chosen not to act on it, and what that choice had cost. She had started the log on the 4th day after the debrief, when she had sat down with her original field notebook from the training week and gone back through every circled note and asked herself honestly, if you had said this out loud, what would have happened? She had spent 4 hours on that question, and the answer, every single time, was some version of something better than what actually happened. She had not been cruel that week. She had not been complicit in the way that requires intention. But she had been silent in the way that requires nothing. And silence that requires nothing extracts its payment later. From other people, in other currencies. She understood that now with a clarity she intended to keep. At 0800, she had a candidate orientation session to run not a traditional intelligence briefing, but a new component that Claire had added to the opening week of the program. It was called the observation and voice exercise, and it was simple in design and difficult in practice. Candidates were taken through a series of scenarios and asked to identify what they noticed, and then separately what they did with what they noticed. The gap between those two things was the point. It was always the point. Maya had written the exercise herself, with Claire's input and one key instruction from her: don't make it abstract. Make it real. Make it about situations they've already been in. Ask them about the last time they saw something and said nothing. Ask them what they told themselves to justify the silence. Ask them whether, looking back, that justification held. She ran at every cohort now. It was the session candidates remembered longest. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest in a way that found the specific place in each person where honesty lives, and had been waiting to be spoken. At 0900, Turner was on the training ground. He had been on the training ground every morning on 900 for 11 weeks. Not as an evaluator, not as an observer. As a participant, running the same physical and tactical assessment battery as every candidate in the program, scored on the same metrics, held to the same standard, with his results posted on the same board where everyone could see them. His physical scores were, as expected, high. His tactical scores were strong. His judgment scores, the component of the new evaluation framework that measured listening behavior, risk communication, and demonstrated responsibility for teammate welfare, had started low and had been climbing. Not because he was gaming the metrics, but because he was actually changing the behavior the metrics were measuring. And that is a different thing entirely, with a different result. He knew the difference now. He had spent 11 weeks learning it in the specific, concrete way that you learn things by doing them, rather than by understanding them conceptually. And the learning had the texture that real learning always has. Slightly uncomfortable, occasionally humbling, and stubbornly durable in a way that classroom understanding never quite achieves. He still led. That was not something he was trying to suppress. Suppressing it would have been its own dishonesty. But he led differently. He had developed a habit in the weeks since the debrief of pausing before he spoke in group situations. Not long, 2 or 3 seconds. Long enough to ask himself whether he was speaking because he had something to add or because the silence was making him uncomfortable. Long enough to notice whether there was someone in the room who had been quiet for a while, and whether that silence might be holding something useful. He was not always right about this. He was not always good at it. But he was trying with the specific, non-performative trying of a person who has understood why it matters rather than simply being told that it does. On the 3rd morning of the new cohort's first week, he was running a terrain navigation exercise with 5 candidates when one of them, a young specialist named Okafor, quiet, technically sharp, with the particular watchfulness of someone who has been in rooms that didn't value what she had said, something that the group moved past too quickly. Okafor had noted during the route planning phase that the eastern approach to the checkpoint had a terrain feature that would provide natural cover for the final quarter kilometer, but would add 11 minutes to the overall time. The group had dismissed it. Turner had started to move on. Then he stopped. He looked at Okafor. "Say that again," he said. "The eastern approach. Walk me through why." Okafor looked surprised, the specific surprise of someone who has offered something and had it bypassed, and is now being asked to bring it back, which is a different emotional experience than being invited in the first place. The ridge on the eastern side, she said. It runs parallel to the final approach. If we use it as a screen, we're not visible to the observation point until we're within 100 meters. The 11 minutes is on the front half of the route. We make it back on the approach. The group looked at the map, then at each other. She's right, someone said. Turner said, run the eastern approach. They ran it. They arrived at the checkpoint without being detected. The first team in that exercise cycle to do so, and they made back 8 of the 11 minutes on the final approach. In the debrief afterward, Turner said to the group, Okafor identified the route. I almost moved past it. That would have been a mistake. Notice what I did, and notice what I should have done instead. Those two things are the lesson. Okafor was looking at him with an expression he recognized, not from looking at other people. From a mirror, 3 months ago, in the briefing hall, when Claire Bennett had looked at him and he had understood what it felt like to be seen by someone who was paying attention. He had worked hard in the weeks since to understand what she had been carrying during that exercise week. Not in the abstract, theoretical way of someone doing an empathy exercise. In the practical way of asking himself repeatedly and specifically what it would require to do what she had done to arrive somewhere with your history removed and your record invisible, and know that the room was going to reach a verdict about you in the first 4 seconds, and that the verdict was going to be wrong, and that you were going to have to work alongside it, and within it, and in spite of it, without the comfort of correcting it. He could not fully imagine it. He had tried, and he could not. But he had gotten far enough into the attempt to understand that it was a different order of difficulty than anything he had managed. And that understanding had done something to his sense of his own capability that was, in the final accounting, useful. Not deflating, calibrating. There is a difference. He knew the difference now. At 1100, Claire was in the training room with the new cohort for their first formal session. She stood at the front of the room, without notes, without a podium, without any of the visual apparatus that communicates authority to people who are looking for authority in the usual places. She looked at 17 candidates who didn't know her, who had arrived that morning with whatever information they'd gathered about the program and its new commander, which varied widely depending on the source. Some had heard she was exceptional. Some had heard she was severe. One, she would find out later, had been told by a buddy at a different base that she was the most dangerous shooter alive. None of them had been told about the depot, about the laugh, about the week she'd spent ranked last, while the room made up its mind about what it was seeing. That was deliberate. She said, my name is Commander Bennett. This program is going to ask a lot of you over the next 6 weeks. Some of what it asks is going to be physically and tactically difficult. That part you're probably prepared for. She paused. The part you may not be prepared for is the part that asks you to be honest. Not honest on a form. Not honest when honesty is easy. Honest when it's uncomfortable. Honest when the group is going in a different direction. Honest when you're wrong and the person who was right doesn't look the way you expected. 17 faces looking at her, attentive in different ways. Some confident, some uncertain, some with a particular stillness of people who have been told this kind of thing before and are waiting to see whether this time someone means it. She said, this program is not selecting for the loudest candidate or the most confident candidate or the candidate with the most impressive file. It is selecting for the candidate who makes sound decisions under pressure, communicates accurately about what they don't know as well as what they do, and accepts responsibility for their teammates as a non-negotiable condition of operating at this level. She looked across the room. If that describes you, you're in the right place. If it doesn't describe you yet, you're still in the right place, because that's what this program is for. She paused. One more thing. During this program, some of your prior record has been removed from the visible evaluation file. Your evaluators will not see your previous commendations, your prior scores, or your unit history during the early assessment phases. You will be evaluated on what you do here, in this program, in front of the people in this room. She looked at them steadily. If that makes you uncomfortable, examine why. The answer to that question is the first useful piece of information this program has given you. She dismissed them to their first physical assessment. In the observation bay above the training ground, Maya was watching the cohort move through the initial layout of the grounds. She was looking for the things she was always looking for, now, not the obvious performances, but the quiet signals. The person who looked at the exits, the person who checked the wind, the person who identified, without being asked, the elevated position at the far corner. She found her within 4 minutes. A young woman in the middle of the group. No visible decorations. Repaired boots, not neglected, repaired, which is a different statement. She was moving with the slight forward lean of someone who is reading the ground ahead rather than the space immediately in front of them. And she had glanced, twice in 4 minutes, at the same corner of the grounds that Claire had glanced at on the first morning of the previous cohort. Maya opened her notebook. She wrote one line. Then, in the action column, she wrote what she was going to do about it. This time, she wrote it immediately. Downstairs, as the candidates passed through the equipment depot for their initial kit issue, the young woman with the repaired boots approached Moss's counter. She set down her request form. She looked at the standard rifle on the rack behind him. Then she said, quietly and without any particular performance, "Excuse me, Sergeant, I have a question about a specific piece of equipment. It may not be on the standard list." Moss looked at her. He looked at her the way he had learned, in 11 weeks of deliberate practice, to look at every person who came to his counter completely, without a conclusion already in place. "What equipment?" he said. She told him. It was not the Black Talon. It was something else, a specific scope modification with a non-standard mount that she had used in a previous posting and believed would serve better in mountain conditions. It was, in fact, a legitimate request with a reasonable operational basis, and the old intake process would have dismissed it without verification. Moss pulled out the new form. He walked her through the 4 lines. He wrote down her name. He wrote down the equipment. He wrote down the authorization chain she provided. And at the last line, if in doubt, verify, before assuming he drew a small checkmark and said, "I'll need to run secondary verification on this. Give me 24 hours and I'll have an answer for you." She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." He said, "That's what I'm here for." She walked away. Moss watched her go, and he thought about the counter on a Monday morning 3 months ago, and he thought about the look on a woman's face when the room had made its decision before she'd finished her sentence. And he thought, this is the work. Not the dramatic moment, not the debrief. This right here is the work. The person who walks up to a counter and deserves to be taken seriously, and whether you do it. He went back to the verification form. He did it. On the 5th day of the new cohort's first week, Turner was running a joint navigation exercise when something happened that nobody had planned. The exercise included a simulated communications failure, a standard training scenario, nothing unusual. Teams were expected to continue operating with degraded comms and make decisions based on available information and their own judgment. It was the kind of scenario that reveals, quickly and cleanly, the difference between candidates who have internalized decision-making principles and candidates who are waiting for someone to tell them what to do. 2 of the candidates handled it well. 2 struggled in predictable ways. One of them, Okafor, again made a decision that Turner would not have made, and that turned out to be exactly right. She had identified a secondary observation point that wasn't on the original mission parameters. She had assessed it, determined it offered superior line of sight to the target area without the exposure risk of the primary point, and rerouted her 2-person element there without waiting for authorization she could not get because the comms were down. They reached the secondary point. They had the target in observation before any other element did. In the debrief, Turner said, "Okafor, walk us through the decision." She did. She was methodical and honest, including honest about the fact that she had not been sure the secondary point would work and had made a calculated decision under uncertainty rather than a confident one. Turner said, "That's the difference between judgment and luck. Luck doesn't know it might be wrong. Judgment does and goes anyway with eyes open." He paused. "That's the kind of decision this program is trying to develop, not certainty. Clear thinking under uncertainty." After the debrief, Okafor came to him. "Can I ask you something, sir?" "Yes." "The first day, the Eastern approach. When you stopped and asked me to repeat myself." She paused. "What made you stop?" Turner looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Because I almost didn't. And I've learned what almost not stopping costs." She absorbed this. "You've done it before, not stopped." "Yes. And it cost something, yes." He said, "It cost something it shouldn't have cost, and someone else paid for it." He paused. "I'm trying not to make that trade again." Okafor nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I almost didn't say the Eastern approach out loud. I almost just let it go." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I wasn't sure the room would hear it." Turner held her gaze. "The room heard it," he said, "and the room was better for it." He paused. "That's what rooms are supposed to do. It's what people in them are supposed to make happen." She walked away. Turner stood on the training ground and looked at the mountains and thought about the chain of it, the way one thing makes another possible, the way Claire not stopping when the room laughed, made it possible for him to be here now. Doing this, making it possible for Okafor to say the Eastern approach out loud and have it heard. The chain was not tidy. It was not linear, but it was real and it ran in one direction, and that direction was forward. At the end of the 5th week, the program held its first formal mid-cycle review. All 17 candidates present, all evaluators present. Turner present, not as an evaluator but as a participant, sitting in the middle of the candidate group the way he had at the debrief 3 months ago, and sitting there without the discomfort that had cost him then. Reed attended. He sat at the back of the room, not at the evaluator's table. He had done this every 2 weeks since the program launched. Come in, sat in the back, watched, said nothing during the session, and spent 40 minutes afterward with Claire going through what he'd observed and what questions it raised for him. He had told his staff the most useful 40 minutes in his schedule. Claire ran the review the same way she ran everything, without excess, without performance, with the clean efficiency of someone who has thought carefully about what is needed and is doing exactly that. At the end, she said one thing that she said at the end of every mid-cycle review, because she had decided early in the program that there was value in a recurring frame that people could return to across the weeks and find consistent. She said, somewhere in this cohort is a person who has been doing the work quietly and waiting to see whether this program will recognize what it's looking at before it knows what it's looking at. She looked at the room. It will, she said. That's what we're here to prove. Later that evening, after the review and the paperwork, and the final check-in with Maya about the next week's assessment structure, Claire walked to the secure display case that had been installed in the main corridor of the school building 3 weeks after she'd taken command. Inside was the Black Talon. It was mounted horizontally against a dark backing, lit from above by a focused light that made the matte finish look exactly as serious as it was. Beside it on a small placard was a single line of text. Not a name, not a date, not a description of what the rifle had done or where it had been. The placard said a uniform can show rank, but it cannot reveal sacrifice. She stood in front of it for a moment, not looking at the rifle, looking past it. At the 11 people who had come home from a mountain corridor 6 years ago. At 3 teammates who had been wounded and were alive. At the local allies who had helped and whose names were not in any record, because that was the condition under which they had helped, and she had honored it and would always honor it. At the choice she had made on that mountain when the radio went silent and the only voice left was hers. She thought about what Grant had said. I know what it cost you. The week. Letting it happen. She thought about her answer. It was necessary. Both things were true. The cost had been real. The necessity had been real. The week of laughing and dismissal and last place rankings and the corner table in the dining hall had been genuinely hard in the way that things are hard when they require you to hold what you know about yourself, steady against a room that has decided not to know it. But the week had also revealed exactly what it needed to reveal, not about the candidates, though it had revealed things about them too, about the program, about the institution, about the gap between what a military selection program says it values and what its design actually measures, about the people in a room and what they do with 4 seconds and a laugh in someone else's thin file. The program was different now, not perfectly different, not finished, but genuinely, structurally, functionally different in ways that would outlast her command and outlast the current cohort and keep working. If the people in it kept working, long after the specific story of one Monday morning at a supply depot had faded from active memory into the kind of institutional understanding that nobody can quite source, but everyone benefits from. That was enough. That was, in fact, the whole point. She turned away from the display case and walked toward the door. Behind her at 06:30 the next morning, Moss would run the verification checklist again. Maya would open the action column in her notebook and write the first observation of the day. Turner would stand on the training ground and pause before he spoke, and ask himself whether the pause was long enough. Okafor would find the Eastern approach in whatever form it took that day and say it out loud without waiting to see whether the room was ready. And somewhere at another base, in another program, in another room full of people reaching instant verdicts about thin files and missing patches and quiet people who ask for things that make the room laugh somewhere, a person was doing the work without anyone recognizing it yet, carrying the weight of what they had done and waiting, with the patience of someone who understands that the real test is never the one they announce in advance. For the moment when the situation declares itself and the work declares itself with it. And in that moment, what would matter was not the patch on the sleeve, not the commendations in the file, not the volume of the voice at the briefing table. What would matter was what it had always mattered. In every corridor and mountain and depot and debrief that had ever contained a real decision, not what the room decided you were, what you actually were when the moment required it. That is the only record that cannot be sealed, the only file that cannot be thinned, the only legacy that does not need a name on a placard to endure, because it lives in what comes after, in the people who were there, and the people they change, and the people those people change in turn, in a chain that runs forward through every room where someone is doing the work quietly and waiting to be seen. Claire Bennett walked out into the morning. The Black Talon stayed behind glass. Her leadership had become the legacy, and the legacy was still being written, one honest choice at a time, by every person in that building who had learned the hard way. The real way, the only way that actually sticks what it means to see someone clearly before you decide what they are.